as your first assignment here at our dealership, we need you to do a setup and pre-delivery service on this 450 Rebel.
Sure, no problem. All you got to do is tighten a few bolts, connect some cables, and fill it with enough gas to get the customer to the nearest gas station.
Well, there's more to it than that. There are specific instructions for each model. Now, here's the binder that contains the setup and pre-delivery service for the 450 Rebel. We also got in this new full-cycle video on setup and pre-delivery service. It'll help you understand the correct procedures. After viewing the program and using the setup instructions, you should be able to uncrate the unit properly, assemble the parts, complete the setup checklist, and clean the vehicle thoroughly for display. The second part of the program will guide you through the pre-delivery service procedures. By using the pre-delivery checklist, you should be able to check all fluids, check the tire pressure, then after starting the engine, check the charging system, and take a test ride to make sure everything works properly. Then clean the vehicle thoroughly for delivery to the customer.
Piece of cake.
There's a VCR in the lunchroom. Study the tape, the instructions, and the checklist, and then go ahead and set up this Rebel. If you have any questions or problems, just ask. I'll check in on you from time to time.
No problem. Set up instructions and tape.
Hi, Mike. How's the new Rebel coming along?
Just great. She's ready to roll. By the way, the setup instructions and your service tips helped a lot. They really made sense. Thanks.
Looks pretty good. Not bad for your first assignment. But just to make sure, Mike, could you tell me what you did beyond tightening a few bolts and adding a little gasoline?
Sure. It wasn't that hard. Well, first of all, I followed the correct setup instructions. They're easy to use.
Right. Because if you don't, you might damage some parts during uncrating or assembly.
But why do some models have two different setup instructions?
Because they are manufactured in both Ohio and Japan. It just depends where it was made. If the motorcycle were made in Ohio, it would be packed in a wood-framed crate. On the other hand, motorcycles made in Japan are packed in metal-framed crates. Each has a different version of setup instructions. The setup instructions have been going through some changes. Older versions have photos in each quarter of the page, with setup and pre-delivery combined. But newer versions contain photos on the right side of the page. Also, pre-delivery service procedures are separated from the setup section. So what did you do next?
Well, before I started the actual setup, I checked for any service letters that pertain to storage and setup, like service letter number 106. Also, I checked for any service bulletins and important setup notices for that model. Motorcycles, scooters, and ATVs each have a different checklist. I used the motorcycle setup and pre-delivery checklist to check off the steps as I completed them. Of course, before I even uncrated the motorcycle, I read through the setup instructions first. And, as you suggested, I walked around the cycle and checked for transportation damage. Then, I cut the straps, removed the carton, and noticed that it was mostly assembled. But on this model, certain parts like the front wheel, handlebars, switches, cables, and seat needed to be installed. So, I checked again for transportation damage. The rules for submitting damage claims are defined in Chapter 10 of the Motorcycle Warranty Policy and Procedure Manual. So, I compared the parts that came packed in the crate against the parts list in the setup instructions. If any loose parts were missing, I'd order them. Then I'd use the warranty transportation claim form to file a transportation damage claim with the manufacturer. Since the Rebel has disc brakes, I used Honda brake cleaner to degrease the discs.
You know, Mike, brake cleaner could damage painted surfaces, so I hope you kept it away from the other parts of the motorcycle.
I sure did. And I wore gloves and eye protection. And when I installed the handlebars, I made sure the holders were facing the right direction, with the handlebar punch marks aligned with the lower holders. The front bolt should always be tightened first, then the back bolt.
Right, that way the back bolt acts as a pinch bolt. By the way, how did you tighten those bolts?
Well, I used a torque wrench on those bolts instead of an air wrench. You never know how much torque an air wrench is applying. And I torqued all bolts specified according to the setup instructions.
What about the cables?
Well, when I installed the cables, I made sure they were routed properly by following the cable routing diagram in the setup instructions.
You know, Mike, that's really important, because if they're not routed properly, the controls won't work right. And you said you'd never done this before?
That's right, but I read each step in the setup instructions before starting. I also checked off each item on the checklist as I went along, or wrote NA for not applicable. Then, I made sure I cleaned the motorcycle. New cycles are coated with a corrosion preventive grease. Also, some tires with raised letters have a protective blue coating. I used soap and water to clean all surfaces, and then dried it thoroughly. Last but not least, I inspected the assembled motorcycle again. Then I reviewed the checklist to make sure I didn't forget anything.
So, that completes the setup procedure. Did you go through the pre-delivery service?
Sure did. The instructions explained every step. And just as I did during the setup, I followed the setup pre-delivery checklist and checked off the items as they were completed.
What about the battery?
I activated it according to service letter number 48.
Something to remember, Mike. For display models, you use a shop battery for your testing instead of activating the new battery. An activated battery needs regular charging to prevent sulfation.
After that, I followed your suggestion and checked the date of manufacture on the steering head of the motorcycle.
You know, Mike, if more than 2 years have gone by since it was manufactured, you'd have to flush the brake system and the fuel tank. And if it sat for more than a year after setup, change the crankcase oil.
How do you flush the brake system?
It's easy. Just open the master cylinder and the bleeder valve, squeeze the handbrake, drain the fluid and replace it. Then bleed the system as shown in the service manual.
Then, I checked the air pressure in the tires and inflated them to the maximum recommended pressure.
I noticed that you checked out the charging system and the components to see if they work properly. And that's important, because we are legally responsible for any assembly or adjustments that aren't done properly.
I know. So I made sure by taking a short test ride to see if everything worked.
I hope it was short, because in some states, 25 miles on a vehicle means that it's used.
So I then checked off the items on the pre-delivery checklist.
Another thing to remember, on a display model, after the test ride, you need to drain the fuel tank and carburetors, since gas turns into varnish and can plug the carb's pilot circuits. After the carburetors are drained, you start the engine and let it run until the carbs are completely empty. And most states prohibit the storing of vehicles that are filled with gasoline. So, what's next?
Well, after that, I made sure the motorcycle was spotless. After all, it's the customer's first impression of his new motorcycle.
Well, since this motorcycle is sold and the owner will be here soon, tell me how you prepared this cycle for customer delivery.
Well, first, I set up and charged the battery. Then, I fill the fuel tank with fresh gas to get the customer off to a good start.
Another reason to fill the tank completely is that the inside of the tank is coated with a corrosion inhibitor, which dissolves in gasoline.
So, if you only put in a small amount of gasoline, the strength of the dissolved inhibitor may cause car problems later.
Right. When you top off the fuel tank, the inhibitor is thinned enough to prevent creating problems in the carburetor's fuel circuit.
After that, I took a second test ride to make sure the carburetors and other systems were working properly. I then looked over the checklist to make sure that I didn't miss anything. Then I signed the setup checklist.
Some state regulations require an imprint of the serial number for the record. Simply rub a piece of carbon paper over the number, stick a piece of clear tape over it, and peel the tape off. Then you apply the tape with the serial number imprint on a sheet of paper and keep it with the dealer's copy of the setup checklist.
And finally, I made sure the motorcycle was completely clean and ready to go.
You got it, Mike. Also, if you notice any cosmetic damage which may have occurred in the shop or the showroom, order those parts. Such damage is our responsibility, and it can't be submitted on a warranty transportation claim. Remember, proper setup and pre-delivery service are essential to reliability and rider safety. Basically, you need to make sure the motorcycle is fully assembled. Take a test ride to check functions, and clean the motorcycle so it looks new. Always use the correct year and model setup instructions for the motorcycle, scooter, or ATV you're working on. Then check the service bulletins and important service reminders to see if any improvements have been made. Before you remove the unit from the crate, check for shipping damage and any missing parts from the factory. If that model has disc brakes, use Honda Brake Cleaner. Make sure to install the handlebars and switches according to setup instructions. Torque the specified bolts according to the setup instructions. Using the cable routing procedure in the setup instructions will ensure routing the cables properly, especially around the handlebars. You should clean the motorcycle with mild soap and water. Then check for scratches, dents, or other cosmetic damage. Order the parts if necessary. So, Mike, after you're done with setup, what do?
Well, you do pre-delivery service. First, I'd change the oil if the motorcycle has been sitting for over a year. I'd also change the brake fluid if the motorcycle sat for 2 years since it was manufactured, and then flush the fuel tank. You inflate the tires to maximum recommended pressure. Then check all the components to see if they work okay. If they don't, you fix them.
And don't forget to keep it clean. Now, Mike, before the owner arrives, tell me the proper delivery procedures again.
Well, you should fill the tank completely with fresh fuel. Then, take a test ride to make sure everything works the way it should. Then sign the setup and pre-delivery checklist form. You should check off the steps as they are completed. Before delivery, you make sure the motorcycle is clean. Then take one last walk around the vehicle to check it out visually.
That's right, Mike. When you follow the proper setup and pre-delivery service procedures, you'll prevent customer complaints in the future.
Thanks for getting me on the right track with the setup instructions. It really helped.
No problem. In fact, the procedures we covered aren't just for this motorcycle. They pertain to scooters and ATVs as well. Feel you could set up some more today?
Piece of cake.
Come on, Mike, I want to show you something. We just got a new shipment in today. Good luck.